All right, thank you for joining us today. This is my first webinar that I'm teaching myself. Usually I'm behind the camera. I'm Tyler Blankenship. I am the assistant marketing director here at Bates Nursery, and I also oversee like audiovisual stuff. But before all that happened, I was a gardener, and I was just coming to Bates Nursery as a customer, inquiring about plants, garden tools, and just kind of taking it all in. And throughout the years, I have learned with my own backyard garden that's on a half of a quarter of an acre, some things that can basically help you get started for the upcoming 2021 growing season. I have Ben Trest here with me today. Yeah. You might recognize Ben from previous webinars. Ben is very helpful. He's like a walking encyclopedia. Knows a lot about trees and shrubs, but also about just horticultural in general, and is going to be filling in any gaps that I may have in my knowledge.
Yep, and I've got my own little backyard garden too, so firsthand experience for sure.
No doubt. So a new year has come, and the chill is definitely in the air. Your plants are good and dead, at least mostly, and you're restless, but you've got limited daylight. Maybe you feel like you don't know what to do or where to start in readying your garden. This webinar is just here to give you some prep tips and easier transition into spring. So let's get started. The first thing after whether it's crazy or successful or you name it, previous growing year, you want to clean up your leftovers in the garden, your leftover plants that have died. And I know like towards the end of the year it gets so hot and you don't really, at least for me, like in the height of August, I just don't really want anything to do with what's growing there. Maybe it's overgrown. Maybe you had a section that you were disappointed in and you kind of just want to forget it happened. Well, now's the time to deal with it. Everything's cold. There's not that many pests. You can put on some layers and you'll get warmed up going and digging these plants out. It also ensures that any fungus or disease or insect eggs won't be overwintering in your garden. It improves the overall health of your next crop going in, as you don't want those things to just sit on your soil. And if you've got a compost pile going, any decaying or dead material can easily be thrown into that, as long as you know that it wasn't affected by like a blight. If your leaves had a lot of spotting or brown, like particularly just nasty looking things, you might want to just avoid that. You could start another refuse pile. And you can also look up, if you're in Metro Nashville, when they do the curbside brush pickup, and you could just throw it in a pile like that. Consider also putting it in like a paper compostable bag to where, it still breaks down, because I don't think they accept anything with plastic. So consider also any structural cleanup too. So maybe you had a trellis that's seen better days. Maybe you built it out of pine instead of like cedar or treated wood, and it's just falling apart. You probably want to address that. Also, a raised bed that didn't work for the location that you planned. This is the great time where you're not going to be sweating down your back trying to move this, while you're also trying to get plants in the soil. So the cooler weather really just allows us to get out and assess the things that worked and didn't work. Weeds is another thing to kick out. It's essential to remove dead weeds before they sprout back again, and some of them are just dormant. Chances are you probably got some in your bed right now. They pop up even through the fall season, and then some of the ones that like the cooler weather pop back up too. If you let clover get established, as much as I love clover, you don't want it in your beds because it gets really thick and matted and it's really hard to dig out. So definitely get them out. And also some of them do not really break down in compost. So the ones that really like reseed heavily, that are really tough to get rid of, you might want to just toss those in with your disease plants and just excommunicate them from your plot.
Yeah, you have a separate location for all those weedy, diseased cuttings or refuse. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, there are. I think there's one of those. What is it? There's like a weed that like when I walk through the grass, it like springs open and the seeds just like fly out everywhere. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I've heard people call them ketchum. Yeah, there's a bunch of names for that, but yeah, I mean, once those things go to seed, it's kind of already done its thing, and until the spring, you know, you want to take care of those now so they're not reseeding in the spring, and then you're just working all summer. So
yes. So yeah, you know, quarantine them if you need to. You can also lay down black plastic if you're looking at a new plot, or like a few tarps, and that will allow you to kind of like essentially stamp out an area of growth that you want to, you know, dig into or plant into. Now's a great time to really like get a handle on that, because, you know, as soon as spring starts, you know, the growth will be new, but you know, the further it gets along, the warmer it gets, the more vigorous the growth, the less that's going to be an effective method. But that'll allow you to clear, you know, you could buy a pretty good sized tarp and clear, you know, a fairly large sized plot that you can then kind of turn over those dead things into the top layer of the soil. You don't really need to till very much, honestly. The first couple of years I did heavy tilling, and I kind of regret it, because as I was walking all over the garden to try and work it again, it kind of compacted all of that freshly turned soil. You know, you might want to consider adding step stones, and I know I'm kind of jumping around here, but step stones like either in between your rows, or even get fun with it and make a path through your beds to avoid stepping on them as much as possible.
Yeah. I'll do my beds 4 feet or less across, so that I don't have to worry, so I can reach across, and that prevents me from walking in it.
Yes.
But yeah, anything to keep you from trafficking all that is really nice.
Exactly. And also there's cool bed designs out there. I mean, I've seen keyhole beds, which are really awesome, that, you know, essentially you kind of walk into this little notch that's cut out, and then you can access all of the plants that are raised, and it's very user friendly. And there's ways to get around this, and this is that time of year where you are in planning mode, cleaning mode. You know, this is a good time to plant bulbs too, because, you know, bulb plants, usually like tulips and iris, are the first thing. Daffodils around here are the first things to emerge in the spring. So be thinking about where you want to layer those. You know, do you want to plant them in a border? Are there some from last year that grew and they're kind of grown together, and they need to be divided? Dividing bulbs is very important for productive.
I've got crocus coming up in my beds already. And I could easily divide it and move it while they're up. So, yeah, absolutely. Good time to look at bulbs.
And so, since we're talking about like cleaning up and digging and weeding, I brought a few tools here. The first one of which is your metal rake. And I probably shouldn't be lifting these up. I should probably point to them, but whatever. Metal rakes, obviously you've seen these a lot in your lifetime if you've been alive, which I know a lot of you have been alive. These work really well to just, you can flip them over and kind of level out your topsoil. It's good for spreading compost, but then you can also use them when you pull your weeds to really just kind of rake them out of the top layer without removing a lot of soil. I use the pitchfork here. This is good for kind of bigger plants I've found that are more established that I want to move, or just weeds that I hate. I just get in there and pry them. It's really good also for lifting up big patches of dead weeds that you pulled. It's also good for turning your compost pile. Like, I have these huge banana trees that I've grown in my backyard, and I compost them every year. So with this thing, I just kind of skewer them like a little smoky, and then just flip them and throw them on the other side of the pile. So this is an excellent, indispensable tool. Also, another indispensable tool is the Dutch hoe, or stirrup hoe. What do you call it, Ben?
I called it a scuttle hoe.
Scuttle hoe, loop hoe. These are available. We sell them here at Bates. We sell all of this at Bates. This one might not be the specific brand, but this Corona
Very
brand
similar.
we carry.
Yep.
But this has really saved me because essentially this just scrapes the top layer of your soil and it actually pulls the weeds out, kind of turns them over and gets them out by the root most of the time.
Yeah, and they're usually pretty sharp. I mean, they will just cut the top of those weeds right off if they're sharpened.
Yeah.
They can save you from doing a lot of bending over.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And it cuts both ways too, push-pull. So you can really get in there. It also works in gravel. It works underneath like mulches that you have. Pine straw probably not so much, but I have an area of rock next to my house, and I use that to get the weeds out from underneath the rocks. It just goes right through them. So I can't say enough about this thing. It's really saved me from bending over.
We do have a quick question. What was the name of that last tool that you pulled out?
Which one?
Pitchfork.
The pitchfork?
I believe it was the third one.
The third one?
The
This one here?
closest to Ben.
Yeah.
That is definitely, it's a Dutch hoe or a stirrup hoe, like the stirrup of a horse saddle, or a loop hoe. You might see it referred to as all of these things. They actually, some of them are pretty broad. Some of them can get it like up to 8 inches a foot wide. Some of them are meant to where you could put your foot on it and kind of give it more leverage. This one's a bit smaller, but it is really good for, like, I can just run it through my garden bed because the soil is already loose. It's not compact. If you run it on top of clay and your sod, you'll find that it's just like, it's like scooping ice cream or something. Like it just peels off that top layer. But it leaves it intact and it takes the weeds with it. So,
Absolutely.
Ben, you've got something here.
Yeah,
What
I
is
brought
that?
one in, just kind of something from home. This is just a soil probe. You could have something that's just a metal rod that does the same thing. This is what most people are using to take soil samples to send those off, and I think Tyler's going to touch on soil testing, but this basically will go down, give you a sample core of the soil. So this is a great tool, pretty cheap, just to give you an idea of what's going on under your soil, so you can stick this in the ground, pull it up, and see how deep your dark layer of soil is, how deep your clay layer is, what kind of compaction you have. And this can also be a good depth gauge. If you can get this down a foot in the ground before you hit, say, rock or a hard surface, it's really going to save you some headache down the line when garden planting. So just a good tool to take an inventory of your soil beneath the surface, where we usually can't see. So handy little soil probe.
Yeah. And there's also another thing that's kind of fun to test soil moisture retention. There's a test that you can do, right, Ben, where you pour it, you calculate the amount of time it takes for a gallon of water to be soaked into the soil.
Yep.
And I forget exactly like how you plug that into, I think, like how much water your soil can hold, but I think it is, you calculate it based on like how long it takes for your soil to like stay wet.
Yeah. I mean, more than if I dig a hole, my rule of thumb is if I dig a hole 10, 12 inches down, and if I put water in that hole and it stays there after 24 hours, that's a sign to me that I have a drainage issue or a water retention issue. It doesn't always tell you everything, but it can tell you if you have a really big problem. Without getting too technical, I mean, it can show you exactly how long your bed's going to stay wet.
And that is a really good point to segue into soil. So drainage is important. Amendments are important. Soil testing is important. And if you can get a soil testing kit from the extension office, Ben says they're like, what, $3?
I think it's like $3 to $4 to get it shipped. It usually takes about a month or so, and they ship that to the ag department. They'll run it through a spectrometer and then send you back basically a detailed analysis of your soil.
And you can take as many samples from different areas of your yard or your garden. You could take it from your bed, but then measure the soil next to your bed.
Yep.
You can see like how acidic it is. Is it good? Like, do you need to mend it for, say, like if you wanted to plant blueberries? You would probably want to know if the soil is kind of rich and more prone to that environment before you designed your garden plot.
And they usually give a report with that too. And they'll give recommendations as to fertilizer, soil additions with that report. So it's a good thing to get done maybe at least once on your property.
It will also definitely give you probably like 3 or 4 nerd points, which aren't redeemable at very many locations around here, but at Bates Nursery, we'll take your nerd points. Yeah. So amendments, good time to top dress with compost. You can, even if you have some manure, let's say you raise chickens, like that litter from the chickens, you can turn into your compost pile. We sell bulk compost here and bag compost under Earth Mix, which is an excellent local sustainable soil company that sources lots of different ingredients, including like poultry litter, I think pine fines, mycorrhiza fungi, and just breaks it all down. It is a living soil, and I like to top dress my beds with that or our mushroom compost, which the mushroom compost is just really rich and like earthy, and it's really light too. It's really good for lightening, like it helps keep raised beds light. I planted potatoes in my raised bed this year with a little bit of mushroom compost and also a little bit of our garden blend, Earth Mix Garden Premium Topsoil Blend. And the potatoes just came right out of the ground when they were ready to harvest. And they were a good size too.
Yeah, and I'll use like garden for like raising levels or a huge addition to the bed, and then the compost I'll use as just like a yearly refresher. Sometimes I use both, but sometimes all I need is a few bags of compost kind of worked into the top of the soil.
Yeah.
Yep.
You got to think of your soil as like a long-term project. It doesn't typically soil doesn't like to be disturbed. With mycorrhiza fungi that we talked about, that creates a network that basically allows better communication between the plants that are in the soil that are growing next to one another for disease pressure, for drought pressure. Like this actually increases the vitality of the plants because they're able to kind of like send these signals like, hey, I'm dry. Are you dry? Yes. Okay, well, then we need to start conserving water. And so it's important that soil is an additive process, both inputs from what you kind of turn over from your garden or your kitchen, like in a compost pile, or also adding leaves. Your leaves break down, that's leaf litter. Grass clippings, even though we do recommend you try and leave your grass clippings in place when you mow, because that is also nutrition for your lawn. But these things can help your garden tremendously. These soil layers, they are soft. They should be, after years of building them up, should be soft and crumbly like brownie batter. And that's kind of what you want to aim for. Easy to just dig your hand into and scoop out, put your new start in, and then press it back in and give it some water. All that also aids all of that aids water absorption as well and retention. We talked about compost, bone meal, kelp, rock phosphate. We also have garden lime here. Ben, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I just garden lime to me is probably it's probably the most used agricultural product. Without really knowing statistics on that, it's probably like number one for farmers, for gardeners, for people doing a lawn. Our soil tends to be acidic in Tennessee, especially with clay content. And I'm just looking, there's even instructions on the back of this bag. Lime won't really be a detriment to your soil if you add a little too much, because this will tend to neutralize your soil pH. So if it's too sweet or too sour of a soil acidity, lime tends to kind of neutralize that. So it's a great thing to add to your soil once a year, twice a year, because it's an organic product. It's really not going to change nutrition content in your soil. But what this lime will do is open up some of those bonds in your soil, the clay bonds, and allow your plants to get at that nutrients, and it'll also break up heavy soil. So lime is a good product to put down every year if you can, and even without a soil test. So this bag gives 2.5 to 5 pounds per 100 square feet, and I believe this is a 5-pound bag, 7-pound bag. So this would do an entire probably vegetable garden plot on top of that. Good product, especially if you don't have a soil test, just to kind of get everything evened out.
Yes, we like knowing kind of no fail, or at least low fail methods.
Yeah,
I mean,
no harm with this product.
Yeah, we're a garden is every year, no matter how much information you take in, it's still a hands-on learning experience. I've got a friend who's made a plot several different ways, and each time he's taken away something from that experience. And so time will add to your collective knowledge of what to do with your garden, but having some tips at hand definitely helps. So let's see.
We do have a quick question about the garden lime. When do you add the lime?
Usually folks are going to do that in the spring or in the fall. If you're going to do it twice a year, I'm trying to think of where Espoma even recommends to do it. Yeah, so early spring or fall. You could do it right now if you want to, is basically a late fall lime addition. It's probably not going to really activate in the soil unless our temperatures are warm. But I would normally say spring is the big one. So right now it'd be a early spring or a late fall application, and then again in the fall. And again, this won't really harm your soil in any way. So if you accidentally do it in the summertime, it shouldn't harm any of your gardens.
Perfect, Ben. Thank you. We do have one more question from Nicole Cook. Would you put lime on before starting the addition of compost and new soil for spring vegetable plants, or at the same time?
I'll do it at the same time. Yeah. Because if you're going to be working compost into the soil or even just top dressing it, that's a good way to get like a nice even spread. So you could probably put your compost down and then spread your lime however you want to spread it, and then work them in together. Just that way you get a nice even mix.
Yeah, and I was going to say, you could use the metal rake to just kind of scratch it into the soil, and kind of just back and forth a little bit. You'll start to see the grains kind of even out, and you don't want to overdo it. Yeah. Just enough to where it looks like it's integrated.
Yeah, and it'll work its way into the soil with rain, so if it's just sitting on top, as long as you don't get erosion, that's totally okay, and it will work into the soil.
Yeah. So I'm going to also segue one great resource that provides daily advice for what you should be doing, at least out on the radar, is the UT Extension, the Tennessee Home Fruit and Vegetable Garden Calendar by the UT Extension. They post it every year, and it has literally on each day, like today, actually, there's a new moon, so it's going to be, I guess, pretty dark out tonight. So today, for January 13th, it says, test germination of leftover seed from last year. As you know, last week we had a webinar on winter propagation by Austin Lowen. That webinar should be live any day now. That, this is where you should be thinking right now. If you're wanting to get started, start your seeds, and then also go outside in your garden, take a look at your soil, and see what needs to be added. On the 25th, adjust soil pH well before planting blueberries. So, this is the time to be considering that stuff. Testing your soil, sending it in.
And like I said, it does take a little while to, if you are sending a soil sample, it takes a little while to get those results. So
I have to say, Caroline Gant is doing a great job filling in for me today.
Thank you, Tyler.
Thank you, Carrie. So swapping back over here. Let's see. Project planning. Let's segue. Oh, you have a good question?
Do have a quick question from Josh Carey about the difference between above ground garden winter prep. Is there much of a difference for raised beds?
similar. I mean, I treat raised beds a little bit more lightly because if you already have a raised bed, you've already kind of worked on it and cultivated it. If we're starting from like just old existing dirt or a lawn, it's going to be a little more intensive because that hasn't already been cultivated. So I think raised beds are easier each year because you've already kind of laid the groundwork. So not much difference, but it's just probably going to be quicker and easier to do your prep.
Yeah, I found that my raised bed soil is still really workable. Mm-hmm. It's really light. It's a lot lighter because typically in an in the ground garden bed, it won't take very long before you hit the base soil layer, which is underneath that rich topsoil that you're starting to create. You know, in ancient times, most of the land mass was covered in forest. Forest was as leaf litter dropped over hundreds of years, it built up what we know as our topsoil, our nutritious layer that all the other plants thrive in. So when you think about that most of our land here was cleared for agriculture and then used for agricultural purposes, and then, post-war developed into subdivisions, and then Ben brought up a good point of soil compaction, heavy machinery leveling the site, grading it. It creates this environment that is not as forgiving for young plants that, things like root vegetables, to just get in there and start taking off and doing their thing. So that's why raised beds are so popular. You create this huge, deep layer of soil that it's really easy for them to grow and expand into. It's good for growing potatoes. It's good for growing carrots. I grew some purple top greens, and the turnip that came from those greens was great. It was approaching baseball size. So I tend to consider those kinds of things when I am looking at my raised beds versus my in-ground beds, because I think that you don't have to have a raised bed for everything. I think that you can also, and I'm going to talk about this in a second, but cover cropping is really great to do in the ground. And I know I've kind of lingered on this question a while, but we're going to kind of turn it into growing crops in between your growing season to cut them down to add to your soil level. And these things can break up the clay, break up the very dense compacted soils, also add nitrogen, which is important for plant growth the next year. I learned of the daikon radish as a really good soil breaker. If you look it up, it's this giant radish tuber that goes down pretty deep into the soil and just kind of wedges itself in there. And that's a great kind of no-till way to kind of loosen your soil up. So, I mean, I could talk a lot about this stuff.
Yeah. Well, I'll say my raised beds, my property is very flat and low, and water likes to sit. So that raised bed actually allows my vegetables to get dry instead of stay wet constantly. So my raised beds basically give my vegetable garden a chance during these heavy rains, so it might bring you up above the water level. My property also has good topsoil, but it's very... Do I need to?
I think Ben's being called into action.
Well,
here.
let me just finish that thought. But so the raised garden bed, I have very low and very shallow soil profiles. that raised garden bed gives me an extra foot. When I hit bedrock about 1.5 feet down, now I have 3 foot of gardening space. Makes a huge difference in what I'm able to grow. So, yeah, I mean, raised garden beds in our area, super, super popular.
Yeah. I mean, you're talking like some places the soil level before you hit limestone, because our basin's really crazy and has these exposed limestone outcroppings. Raised beds are really great for that. Like if you head east of Nashville, you'll see a lot of that as the basin really begins to bottom out, and maybe that's the best environment for you. Now, you also have to consider we have a lot of evergreens growing here, so the soil is acidic, like Ben said, but that's why berries do so well here also. So then, think, okay, well, maybe I've got a cedar or some kind of evergreen, a juniper growing nearby. Maybe I have the right amount of sunlight. Maybe I want to put this bed here. Maybe, so I want to segue into planning. And Ben, feel free to.
I'm gonna hop out. I might be back.
Go anytime you need. Okay, so I'm gonna dive into project planning. And this is something that's really great because you don't have to really be outside very much for this process. You essentially are thinking like this is your time to dream big. What worked last year and what didn't? Like I was saying, the trellis that maybe fell apart. Like I designed a bean trellis that looked like this pyramid, but I designed it out of pine, and the beans that I started growing up, this trellis died, and it completely sucked. And so I just kind of repurposed that trellis. I positioned it over my blackberry, and I know it's not a pyramidal trellis isn't the ideal structure for supporting a blackberry, but I made it work. I grew the cane up through the top, and then I snipped it, and it started sending it out. And you'll start seeing as you work with structures and plants what they prefer and what they don't. I also built an improvised kind of wooden beam, very simple, just staked it into the ground, and then I took a metal fence panel and put it over the top, kind of like a hanger, a very crude, poorly made hanger, and then I put insect mesh fabric over the top of it, and that protected my strawberry beds. So you often find practical ways to kind of make things work. Now, if you can really afford to go all out, lumber, things like that, start looking on Pinterest. Google's a good route. Instagram as well. There's plenty of inspirational structures that are made. Greenhouses from repurposed windows. We're talking, cold frames that actually use old windows over a raised bed to be able to grow cool season vegetables like arugula or kale or even broccoli, because it really doesn't take very much in this climate to grow cool season plants throughout the winter. I even had a cabbage that survived one winter, and I just left it outside with no cover at all. Some other frost protective measures you might want to consider. We have these very simple things. You can also use milk jugs that you cut the bottoms off of, hot caps. So you can place these over your young plants that you plant out early in the season, and this will protect them from frost. You can also water around that plant, and the water will help insulate the soil temperature from actually freezing. It'll keep it a few degrees warmer. And these hot caps also help. Just remember, after the cold night is past, usually, especially in early spring, lift these guys off or they're gonna suffocate. It gets really hot really quickly. Another thing I have, and I have cleverly pinned under all these tools, this is a grow tunnel, and this is awesome for early pest resistance and for frost protection, and to get your cool season crops off the ground. This could make or break like your broccoli crop or cauliflower, things that are susceptible to cabbage moths, which they show up very early in the season and they start ravaging stuff. I mean, I barely get my first broccoli crop out before they're already chewing up the leaves.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they'll tear them up.
Same thing with Brussels sprouts. A lot of cool season vegetables. Let's see. So there's some of these frost-proof methods you might want to look at. Definitely going into it. Let's see. And also here in Middle Tennessee, we get a lot of rain, especially in the winter. February is almost our rainiest month of the year, I think.
Yeah, probably.
Oh yeah, we have a question.
We do have a quick question from Jennifer Pack. Are the tunnels reusable?
I think so.
Yes.
As long as you take care of them. And that's probably a zipped bag, so a lot of them do come with a store. You could store them.
Velcro.
Yeah. Hard part is just keeping them clean from year to year and, making sure they don't get messed up and cut, but you could definitely get a few seasons out of these.
So they come with metal stakes, and this is actually like landscape fabric. It's just white. It feels like the same kind of material, so I imagine it would last a couple seasons. And yes, don't leave it out all year. After you won't need it once we get really warm, and those plants will start to suffocate if you don't lift up the sides. This is mainly for cool season growing. You might see, if you drive out into rural parts of Tennessee, you might see some gardeners employing these on a larger scale. They'll use like plastic, and then during the day you'll see the bottoms, they'll kind of lift the skirt up around the sides to let those plants ventilate. But it keeps them warm throughout the evening.
Yeah, plastic can also be used to kill weeds on hot days, so you do have to be careful not to roast your vegetables underneath like plastic tarps and things like that.
Yes, normally we like our vegetables roasted, but not before they actually are vegetables.
Harvested, yeah.
So yes, well, like I was saying, with rain, it's a great opportunity to observe water flow on your property. Not only just for like seeing how it affects structures like foundations, but maybe eyeing a new garden plot. Maybe there's an area that kind of gets a little soggy and you can take advantage of that free water. Maybe too much water flows through your yard and you need to regrade. Or even better yet, take advantage of Metro's subsidized rain barrels and set up this water catchment system, which is really easy. You just kind of like hijack the water that comes out of your gutter and divert it to these rain barrels. The ones that they sell, I think, are 50 gallon. I got one last year. They did really good COVID protections too for picking these up. You stayed in your car, windows up, you just put your name up on the window, and then they opened the back and threw it in. It's amazing. And I've saved so much water. I've used it to fill up a small pond that I have in my backyard. I've used it in just watering in perennials. Obviously the water's not potable, so I wouldn't drink it or use it for any kind of ingestible project, but definitely watering it into your soil, A-okay. Another aspect of that is drainage. So sometimes, you don't want your plants sitting in water unless you're like making a rice patty or something. Or a cranberry patch.
Yeah. Yep.
Bog. So you want to dig at the downslope of wherever this water problem is happening, a relief kind of trench. And you can kind of help, as you see the water flow, kind of guide that natural drainage that's already happening on your property. And maybe you have to dig a trench and put a French drain in this trench to allow the moisture to soak down into this pipe and then ventilate it. I tend to plant most of my garden beds, or make most of my garden beds kind of up from the bottom slope of my yard, because I don't want it to sit all the way at the bottom where all that water collects, but I do want it to catch the water that's flowing through my property. So I'll kind of like make these, I have these pathways with my garden. They have mulch in them, and the mulch kind of slows the water down. And the mulch is really great at helping retain water. So whenever this rain washes over my beds, it kind of gets stopped and it soaks through a bed, and then it moves to the next bed, and then it makes its way off the property. And slowing down water is one of the best gifts you could give to your garden, because using water from like city water can be very expensive, especially in the middle of the summer when they need it the most. All right, I'm talking a lot. If you've got questions, just post them in the chat. We'll have a Q&A at the end. We're kind of approaching the end now. Another book that I just want to throw out there, or a resource, is Backyard Homestead by Carlene Madigan. That is where I started with my garden. It really teaches you how to grow in a very small area. It also teaches you a kind of general overview of vegetables, berries, fruits, even raising, if you're into this, raising animals for like livestock in small areas, small crops of wheat, if you're into that too, like making your own grains. And it kind of really is a primer for you figuring out how much you want to get back from your yard, because our yards are really these underutilized spaces that can be full of productivity, if not at least habitat for our native species. And maybe dedicate, at least 10% of your yard to just native species habitat. Leave some of the native kind of like more weedier plants that you think you don't like in your garden to grow in a little area, so that maybe these little wrens that we have, or these yellow finches, the goldfinches, have a place to overwinter. It kind of helps your garden out too, because these little guys will be foraging and they'll be pecking off insects and eating your berries and pooping them out and just making everything a little bit more vigorous. So moving back towards my itinerary. Also consider things that aren't as functional in your garden. Maybe you've wanted a bench for a while. Maybe you wanted a place to just sit and like look at what you've done. You need that. I have a patio next to my garden, and I hang a hammock in my patio, and I just lay in my hammock like at a 90-degree angle and just look at my garden, and I watch the butterflies like feed on the flowers, and I just swing back and forth. And like, that's really good for your mental health, Like, I think everybody deserves something like that. So think about like, maybe there's a shelter that you'd like to build. Maybe you design these little corners into it, so during the winter the wrens can fly up in there and sleep at night, and then during the hot summer months you can sit under it and not be so cooked by the sun. They have these really cool kind of, what are they, like black mesh things that you can stretch over, and it's kind of like a shade cloth.
Yeah, they have all sorts of different sizes and shapes of shade cloth. Yeah, because you really don't want to be doing all that stuff in the middle of the hot summer. So yeah, being prepared and just being ready, so you have yourself a little place to take respite, or even a little place for your plants to cool off in the afternoons. So yeah, it's good. It's good to start that early.
One of my hacks that I particularly enjoyed this year was taking a UV resistant beach umbrella and sticking it in a PVC pipe, and then I screwed the PVC pipe to a heavy base. But that allowed me to carry this beach umbrella around with me without jamming it into the soil. And it was like, then, obviously these are the times of COVID, but, people can shelter under this umbrella with you, and you can feel that little bit of survival together as the sun rays beat down on you. So wrapping this up, I think we've covered most things that I can consider planting bulbs, looking at your plot, your space, propagation. Definitely check out Austin's webinar on that. We'll also have another general propagation webinar coming up soon. And what else is on our radar, Caroline?
All right. Well, we'll start with a couple questions, and I'll look back over that calendar.
Oh, sure.
So coming from Barbara Gossett, she asked, would you talk a little bit about the use of bone meal, and can you use too much?
Yeah, bone meal, there definitely is a recommended limit, and unlike lime, I think bone meal could don't necessarily burn your bulbs, but damage them if you're doing way too much. In my experience, what I've used bone meal for is for basically in the hole planting with your bulbs. I know you can use it as basically an after-the-fact top dressing, but in my experience when planting bulbs, we'll dig the hole, put bone meal down in there, whatever the rate, if it's an espoma product, it could be different from a different bone meal product. So just make sure you're doing the rate on the bag, and they'll usually say per bulb. And that's usually somewhere around like a tablespoon to a half a cup, something like that per bulb. But yeah, definitely follow the directions on the bag as far as portioning. But yeah, that's something I'll do when I'm putting the bulbs in, put the bone meal in the bottom of the hole, drop the bulb, cover it up. That's really going to add a lot of vigor to those bulbs and help them come out stronger and really help with blooms. So definitely a good idea while you're sticking them in the ground.
You might also benefit from our demystifying fertilizer webinar that we have coming up. We'll dive into all of these because all of these are basically inputs that get us these NPK number improvements that help certain aspects of plant growth. Espoma here actually makes different blended varieties of amendments. So it's not so much of a kind of one for one, like, well, I need bone meal for this. Like maybe it has a little bit of bone meal mixed into it. Biotone is really great for starting plants off, and I use that regularly in my garden. Also, we have a tomato tone product. I believe we have like a bulb or tulip tone. Yeah.
And that might have bone meal in it.
That's
most likely it does.
Yes. And so these will also have other helpful amendments that you don't have to buy the individual bags unless you're looking to cover a pretty big bed or a huge area, in which case bulk buying these and mixing them might be better off for you.
Yeah, great. And that webinar, Demystifying Fertilizer Labels, is going to be January 20th with Austin Lowen. So
Next
get
week.
Signed up for that. Yeah,
Tag.
Next week. All right, so moving on, do I really need to dig down 2 feet and put in gravel to make asparagus bed? I have clay soil.
That's something I'm not 110% sure of. I would think gravel would not necessarily be the only solution. I think the reason for the gravel is probably to make sure they're not sitting wet and rotting, which asparagus definitely can do. But if you have good draining soil, meaning if we have rain one day, it's not staying soaking wet within about 24, 48 hours, I wouldn't necessarily worry about the gravel underneath it and digging that far down. I don't have so much experience with asparagus myself, but I do know that they do tend to go pretty deep, and a lot of people dig down quite a bit of distance. And I think that's similar to like tubers and potatoes, where the more loosened, lightened soil you have, the more vigorous those asparagus are going to be, or potatoes. So I think loosening that soil, as long as it is not, you said you have clay, you might consider mixing in a soil conditioner like the landscape mix we make, or even the pine fine mulch.
That's a great soil lightener.
Yeah, the pine fine is just a screen pine bark, very small particles. But if you mix that maybe 50-50 with where you want to plant the asparagus in that soil, it should do the same thing the gravel would do. Then again, I would go down probably at least 6 inches, maybe up to a foot. I think any extra lightening of the soil is just going to help that asparagus beef up as it grows. So
Perfect.
And I do actually have asparagus growing in my garden. Yeah, Carrie's saying she does too. So
I do too.
Yeah,
currently, yeah, it's still going.
We're speardos, I guess. Asparagus speardos.
That's right.
So mine are growing in a border bed that is raised up probably about 8 to 12 inches from the soil line. Now, this border bed, though, is up against my neighbor's driveway on the other side of my fence. Now, I know that layer of driveway probably is only like 4 to 8 inches of a concrete slab, but it has no problem producing quite profusely, and I doubt that there is very much amendment in that established. It was there before I purchased my house. So, and the owner said you should, as long as you let the spears grow out if they're really thin, and then the next year, if they're big enough, then you can cut them. And as I've done that, I've gotten slowly over the years more spears. I don't have that many asparagus plants. There might be 2 there, but now, I'll get like a good like little bushel. And they're one of the first things to shoot up, by the way, in spring. They will get the jump on you. And, you have to cut them before they're a certain length or they could get bitter, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you want to keep an eye on that too as you grow and learn with your asparagus. Any other questions?
Yeah, we do have a couple more. From Jason, he said, do you use any type of mulch to top your beds, and what are the pros and cons?
Okay. I can go first here real quick.
Sure.
I've used a few different mulches. And the first one that I used, and it was the most readily available to me, was straw. The downside of straw is that if it is not broken down, and it's really hard, like if you go to a home center like Home Depot or Lowe's, you don't know if that straw has been composted enough that it won't reseed, and most oftentimes it will reseed in your garden bed, giving you a nice new yard where your vegetables are supposed to grow. So be mindful of that if you get a bale of straw, you want it to kind of break down a little bit first. You might want to just let it break down over the winter through maybe part of the summer before you apply it, maybe as like a fall mulch, or vice versa. Get it towards the end of the year, let it break down into winter, and then apply it as a spring mulch. Also, pine straw is I would say probably the most bang for your buck, where you could get a good spread and depth for mulch. I use pine straw in a separate bed where I grew herbs. I also grew roses in that bed and a few other kind of flowers. I like meadow sage, bee balm. So I had it in this bed. It was really easy to move to plant new things. But if you keep applying it over time, it will modify your soil acidity. So you have to be mindful that maybe you want to grow blueberries in this bed, or something that would be more readily accepting of that. Then that becomes like a double lot. Like, hey, I have mulch protection, I can improve the water absorption and protection, and I've got this great kind of little light fertilizer that happens. And you might still need to amend with some additional fertilizer, but it definitely helps. And then, so I moved from, after I had this crazy straw incident where I had a second yard, I moved to wood chip mulch, and I used just a hardwood mulch, and it's lasted a couple years, and I top it off every year. I tend to not use cedar because it lasts a little too long, and cedar can actually kind of be prohibitive, I've found. Cedar's great for pathways though, but hardwood mulch has tended to last the longest, because like if you use pine bark mulch or something, it'll break down in like a season or two.
A year or two.
Yeah, so just be mindful that most mulches you're gonna have to apply every year, unless you go for that kind of harder route.
Yeah, and like the cedar chips would be the one that I wouldn't use, because that is one product that does not want to break down. Unless you want that mulch for a long time, the cedar chips will kind of stick around. I am kind of a lazy vegetable gardener. I do not mulch my vegetable beds, so it's not like you 100% have to. When we're talking about garden beds, we usually say mulch is huge for like looks and for color, which you can definitely have a pretty vegetable bed. Helps it be a little more approachable. But then the big ones are soil retention and weed control. I'm trying something this season, which is a cover crop. So I'm trying to grow fava beans.
Oh yeah, cover crop is another good way.
And that's kind of taking some of the place of the mulch, to where if these winter crops get big enough, they can actually shade out and push out some of these weeds.
I swear by crimson clover, I've grown it. Typically, you plant it about a month before frost, so we're a little bit past the time for that. But in the next month or two, if it is growing, it becomes a pasture of this beautiful, like dark red, kind of spiky looking flower. Bees love it. And it grows probably 18 inches.
Yep. And the idea is when it gets really hot, that stuff is going to basically start dying out, and that adds to your soil composition. You could even do these cover crops in the spring. If you have an area veggie garden that you're not going to fuss with this year, put a cover crop on it, and that'll work into that soil all year. But yeah, because I don't put mulch down, I'm having to deal with weeds every season. So it's definitely a trade-off. I use a lot of pine fines in mine because I specifically want it to compost because I'm raising my raised beds every year.
And that's
so
a good
with that
way.
product, I can just throw compost on top of it, and it doesn't interrupt the soil layering. So, mulch is definitely great. Not 100% necessary, but you are going to have to do a lot more work on your end as far as weed control and possibly watering if you don't mulch.
I also use our Earth Mix natural brown mulch to mulch over anything that needs to be cut down and overwintered. So like elephant ears, I'll cut those down, put a good 2 to 4 inch layer of natural on top. I also have these giant banana trees, and they overwinter underground every year. And I top them with 2 bags each pile because they are massive. They're probably 3 foot by 3 foot or more. And that does the trick. It's just a simple and easy mulch, and that will break down and feed their kind of little area over time. And each area is going to be different. Maybe rock mulch works for you in this certain area of your garden where you've got more arid plants. Like if you're growing prickly pear, either for fruit or just for looks, just rock it up. Because it'll allow drainage. It will do some protection against moisture loss, but it also will probably reflect some heat too.
It does get a little hotter. So if you have a full sun area with rock mulch, that's about the only place I would be a little worried. Of course, if you have plants that love the heat, it's just going to make them grow quicker. The rocks actually might raise your soil temperature early in the year, so you might get better germination right off the bat just because of that raise in temperature.
Yeah, just be ready. If they're in an active garden bed, you'll want to definitely peel those away before you go adding anything to the soil, because you don't want to introduce those rocks into your soil.
Great. And moving on to our next question, do you have resources to recommend for learning about native species? That's coming from Lindsay Martin.
Well, one of them is our very own Joy Bovin, who did a webinar not but a month or two ago about native species. That is available on our webinar archive, which is under blogs on the Bates Nursery website. You'll see Botanical Bootcamp webinar archive. That is a great start.
And she also has Native Species 201 coming up on January 26th.
Yeah, and I'm sure she talks about edibles in some of those. And even if you just want to come in, we do have handouts that we've collected that list out specifically native species. Native species gardening is something we're real excited that people are becoming interested in. The tough part can be really limiting. So, if we're doing an edible garden, a vegetable garden, what plants actually are native can be a little bit convoluted and tough to get a hold of. So, there's tomato varieties that have been heirloom and bred here. Now, whether they're truly native might be debatable. Same thing with apple trees. But there are a lot of plants that are absolutely 100% native, like serviceberry. I mean, those will produce basically blueberries on a tree. Most of your brambles, raspberries, blackberries, blueberries.
And we have some great thornless varieties of blackberries, so you don't have to be afraid of, and you get a great crop every year. I grow Natchez On my property, the fruit is like this big around, and you might have to use some bird netting, but it's worth it.
Yeah, and I really do think there's probably not as much documentation out there as there could be on like edible gardening with natives. I mean that is something that people are expressing more interest in. And nativars are out there to where they're making better varieties of natives. So. Absolutely. One
beneficial plant that I've planted in my garden, and it takes a little bit for it to get it established, but it is actually nitrogen fixing, and beans are also nitrogen fixing too. So and we haven't touched on crop rotation, but there'll probably be another webinar for that. But there are plants that take a lot of nutrients from the soil, and then there's plants that give it. Like bring it in. Beans, for example, can bring nitrogen into your soil, and then you can still get a crop from it. So one of those plants is called blue false indigo, and it is a really beautiful. And we actually sell it. We sell a yellow variety, don't we? And a blue here, kind of a cherry.
And that's in the pea family.
Yeah.
So this gets a little technical, but anything that's Fabaceae, so that plant family. Anything in that plant family will fix nitrogen. So fava beans, peas, anything like that, you can pretty much put it in that category of adding nitrogen to your soil.
You want to talk about another double lot plant? Buckwheat. I have grown buckwheat as a summer cover crop, and I've kind of let one of my garden beds idle, and I'll just grow that. It grows up in this lovely kind of lush green growth with these little white flowers, and then after that, the buckwheat grains form, and you can harvest those grains, and maybe you could make like a round of buckwheat pancakes every now and then if you set up a mill in your backyard, if you're crazy enough to do that. Also, now this one's this might annoy your neighbors a little bit, but I grow passion flower, Passiflora incarnata.
I have some too.
And Carrie's shaking her head. She's like, no.
Just plant it away from your house and your other garden beds.
Yeah.
Unless you want to be pulling it.
Yes, but it is a fantastic, really weird fruit. It's our native wildflower here. Our state wildflower is the passion flower. It's vining, so it can shade. It's also home to the Gulf fritillary butterfly, which is kind of like definitely a symbiotic partner caterpillar butterfly. And the great thing about that plant is that if you do have those butterflies that nest, they almost completely devour it back to stem. But it still doesn't control, like if the fruit come off and then decay in your garden and overwinter, you'll probably get more passion flower. That's almost inevitable, but I deal with it because I love it. I think it's beautiful. I think the flowers are crazy looking. And a lot of natives might be on that kind of verge of like, ooh, I'm really vigorous in this climate. So you have to balance that with the other traditional plants that you keep in your garden. Also, strawberries.
So true, Tyler.
Strawberries are really good, and they grow here.
And they can take over. I've seen them take over raised garden beds eventually if you don't control them. So
you're talking strawberries or passion flower?
Strawberries, yeah.
Yeah, mine are currently seeking a new area to colonize, but I've got this very huge rosemary above it, and so like the little strawberries are like, no, come on, and the rosemary's like, get away.
All right, so moving on to the next question. And this would be a good question for Joy, who we mentioned earlier today, and she does have a great webinar about birds that we did a few months ago.
Yes.
That should be in our archives.
Yep. For the birds is what it's called.
For the birds.
Planting to attract wildlife. Check that one out.
So Ann Salisbury was told not to cut common milkweed stalks to help orioles with their spring nest building. Is this correct?
Yeah, so milkweed, if you don't cut the seed pods off, they have a very distinct seed in them. It's almost like a little seed attached to a ploofy feather.
Yeah, feathery plume.
It literally looks like cotton, and that's what the birds are using. So, yeah, milkweed. Now milkweed will grow from the tubers, so you could cut milkweed off at the ground. It will survive year to year.
It doesn't even look like anything's there, and then you're like, whoa!
It will surprise me. But if you leave those seed pods on, when they dry out, Mine probably dried out around mid-November. But yeah, I mean, the birds, that'll be one of the first things they pick are those little fuzzy, they're little seed plumes is what they are. So, yeah, absolutely. Leave them on there.
And I would say, yeah, backing up that, and I realize we're way past that point now, but some things you do want to leave up, and like a good point is your irises. You want to leave that growth, like even after the petal dies from your irises, you'll see those green leaves, fronds still up. Leave those up through the year, and let them regenerate for next year, and then you can cut it back when everything's dormant again. There's a lot of things that can benefit from a pruning, like say wood that's already fruited from a blueberry. You could prune it back a little bit, and then it will have new vigorous growth in the springtime.
And that would be a good thing to do right now. Is if you need to do any shaping, pruning back of blueberries,
fruit trees,
you could do that right now.
We've got a fruit tree, the basics of fruit tree pruning webinar coming up too. This is a good time, definitely, just before things start to spring out, because once the buds start swelling, it kind of hurts the tree if you don't make it in time.
And that webinar is going to be January 21st.
Yeah, I mean, it's coming up quick. We're quickly approaching kind of the back end, the later window of when you're supposed to be doing some of these things. So be mindful and thinking towards that.
Yeah, and I feel like a big lesson from today is spring is going to sneak up so fast before you know it, and it's nice to be prepared so we're not having to scramble and do everything all in early March. It's nice to line some things up beforehand to make it a little more relaxing.
Yep, pull up that extension calendar. You'll be set.
That's right. So we do have a couple more questions coming in just to wrap up the webinar.
Okay, I'll try and be brief, so I hope to not keep everybody too long.
We're here, we're listening, and we're learning all together. So coming from Richard, he asked, if you were putting out dianthus or coreopsis, what fertilizer would you use?
Me personally, I would just use, I'm a big fan of coated fertilizers, again, because I like to be a lazy gardener. Coated fertilizers like Osmocote is a name brand. We sell other coated fertilizers because those are just perennials. You don't have to fertilize them, but just a real general purpose fertilizer. If you're looking at those three numbers like 10-10-10 or 14-14-14 or something typically at or below 20%. So you don't want a number above 20 for most of those. And most of those Osmocote products are around 14 or 15%, I think. And those will release over time. So if you use a coated fertilizer, it'll give you 4 to 6 months of feeding. If you don't, you could just use a bed fertilizer like Miracle Grow, like Blue Water, people will call it. You could totally use that product. I wouldn't be doing that like a liquid fertilizer until we're getting real close to spring when it's warm enough to really be of use to those plants. But yeah, I mean, any fertilizer for, I believe it was Coreopsis and Dianthus, those are pretty resilient plants. So any general fertilizer, nothing above 20%. Just make sure if it's a instant release fertilizer, something that's not coated, do that probably closer to spring, maybe like early March, end of February. If you do it now, it may kind of release prematurely into your soil. So coated fertilizer, or in springtime, you can just do any general garden fertilizer.
I also like to sprinkle, just in general, I have Espoma Biotone and Plant Tone and Garden Tone. I typically alternate those products depending on what I need. Also for my blueberries, I use the special soil acidifier for those, and with a little bit of Plant Tone. But I just spread just the recommended amount in around the drip line of the plant, not against the base. And then I'll typically cover that up with a little bit of mulch and just let it kind of like water in as the rain falls. And I'm more hands-off with my gardening. I'm not a scientific gardener. Are you going to survive? Because I hope you are, and we're going to be in this together. But if you don't survive, don't take it personally. I might not be planting you next year. Because ultimately, like, I have a life, and I want to balance my garden life with my life, you know? So if something doesn't work for you, cut it out. Try again next year. It's not the end of the world.
And those tone products are all low percent of really any of the nutrients. So the tone products, you're not going to do any harm using any of those. They're not going to damage your soil. Yeah.
Great. And we have one final question coming from Terry Ramsey. What about pruning hydrangeas? I know it isn't a vegetable or a fruit, but I'm confused on that, which I feel like, Ben, you'd be great at talking about that because you just recently did a webinar
we just
on
did it.
hydrangeas.
It's not online yet, and I have to get it online.
Oh, Tyler.
So it's all on me.
We're finalizing them. But yeah, I did kind of a stand-in on hydrangeas for Austin a couple weeks ago. It does depend on species. You basically want to know whether this is going to be a hydrangea that'll bloom on new wood, meaning it's going to bloom whether you cut it back or not, or an old wood. So most of our pink and blue ones are macrophylla. They're setting their buds right now for next year. So if you were to do a hard cut on those, you do risk losing your blooms. Now there are reblooming varieties and some that do new and old wood. But good general rule of thumb is to find out if your hydrangea, one, what species it is, and then whether it blooms on new or old wood. If it's new wood, you can go ahead and cut it back. If it's old wood, I tend to do more thinning of those, because remember, whatever you take out, you may not get blooms on next year. A good example is, so like I say, a macrophylla hydrangea, like an endless summer. Even though those are reblooming, I would keep your pruning in the fall and not going into spring. And then versus that, the Annabelle hydrangeas, the arborescens, those will bloom on new wood. They'll even bloom twice a year if you cut them back. So just depending on what hydrangea you have, you're welcome to call us or bring in a cutting if you're not 100% sure. But yeah, I mean, you can cut hydrangeas back right now, especially if they bloom on new fresh wood.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Ben, for answering that question. That was our last one. We do have a webinar coming up this week with Vanessa, all about grow lights on Friday, the 15th of January.
Yep. I employ the use of grow lights. I just overwinter my citrus plants, but I'm sure I'll be learning a lot more from Vanessa when she chimes in about how she uses stuff, because she is a plant wizard. She has a greenhouse.
Yeah, this is totally new to me, so I'll have to check that one out.
So I want to thank you all for tuning in today. Thank you for staying with Bates Botanical Bootcamp. Thank you for Ben for joining me today. We have, like I said, an archive of these webinars on our blog, and you can also visit the homepage of our website. Scroll down to Bates Nursery Botanical Bootcamp. There's a tile there, and click Reserve Now. And that will take you to our calendar. If it hasn't already been posted, it's relatively easy to find. And we have webinars going out to March. So stay tuned for those. We've got a lot of good topics. I'll also be teaching another one later on down the line too. And we just want to help you out, learn as much as you can, and we'll all grow together. Thank you.